The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
So I had titled today's message, Holidays on Parade, and I had something different in mind than what you're actually going to hear, because we part of this whole season, starting with Halloween. It seems like it's nonstop holiday food, candy eating, costumes, celebrations, and more food. And we UUs are pretty good at the food thing. I learned from a little column in our local voice in Oxford that there are even more holidays during the season of December than I had ever imagined. I was, of course, aware that Hanukkah was in there and that a lot of people celebrate solstice or Yule rather than traditional forms of Christmas, which are celebrated by most, well, if not all, I guess, of the Christian-oriented churches. But there's stuff like Pearl Harbor Day on December 7th, World AIDS Day on December 1st, National Noodle Ring Day, who knew, on the 11th. Celebrations of the writing of certain rock and roll songs. There's this is hysterical. International Monkey Day, too. Not for the monkeys with K-E-E, but for monkeys. Who knew? There's also a Roasting Chestnuts Day. National Chocolate Covered Anything Day is December 16th. So, you can just celebrate and eat all through the month. And originally I started out to do a look at all the other holidays celebrated by the major world religions. And then I thought, this is something that anybody can Google. All you have to do is put in religious holidays in December, and your magic phone will tell you all you need to know. And I couldn't think of a lot of really relevant commentary about these holidays. I mean, if I'd given a lot of thought, I might have come up with different correlations. A lot of them do involve lighting and fire, like Diwali and among the Hindus in India. But some of the holidays only turn up periodically in the December period because they're based on moon calendars and so on. So I thought, no, that's not what I'm going to do. So then I remembered that at different points in my ministry, I've done a sermon that has often been well received because, and I never can do the same one twice because, of course, my life goes on. And 20 years or more have passed since I last did this. So this is kind of a self-indulgent sermon. But I guess this year's title is When You Won't Be Home for Christmas. Now, like most of you, I have always thought it was very odd that a holiday whose central story is about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and essentially being in a place that few normal people would think of as home. But that holiday has become associated through the years with home, and so people now think that if you're not celebrating in the bosom of your family, blood relatives, preferably in some kind of ancestral home, there is something seriously wrong with you, and somehow you have not been living right. The reality and are to be pitied. But I really think that a better metaphor for a modern experience that's similar to the original Christmas story would be being stuck on the New Jersey Turnpike, having to check into a Motel 6 during a blizzard, and celebrating with a passive group of, I don't know, maybe a biker gang or something. Would be a more apt parallel for the nativity story of being on the road, not staying where you planned, and finding yourself in unlikely and random company of cows, sheep, shepherds, and some strange wise dudes from the Far East. But for about 2/3 of my life, I have been one of those strangers who's not been home for Christmas. And it's been increasingly difficult for me to imagine over the long years of my life just where home might be anyway. I have blood relatives, of course, as you know, here in Mississippi, sister in North Carolina, now my adopted son in Florida, armies of friends, as I like to call them, my family of choice in D.C., Santa Fe, Boston, and the Bay Area. Since I became a minister about 25 years ago, I have almost never spent a Christmas in any of those places that might vaguely be called home because guess what? I'm usually working over the holidays. Now, we all know that we're living in a uniquely displaced time, and that lots more folks than normal really have no official home of their own at the moment. I have read that the number of homeless in many major cities, especially those in warmer climes, has been growing constantly, and the population of who is in that homeless population has changed to include many families and lots of children who certainly didn't sign up for this. But there have always been periods through history when lots of people were displaced. We've always had refugee communities, perhaps not as vast as the number around the world these days. But the number of displaced persons these days probably is getting to be competitive with those who have the kind of traditional holiday season that I was describing. Back in World War II, a lot of people were displaced around the world, and a relative of mine had a wonderful story that she would tell at family gatherings. She lived in Dallas, Texas, and one of the war years at Christmas, there was a big family gathering with all the people that were able to get home from the various armed services for the holidays, and with all the friends and family that had left at home. And they were out on the yard in the warmth of a Dallas Christmas, and two lovely young soldiers joined them. And by the time they decided to go into the house and get ready for eating, those soldiers had become part of the group. And so they came in and took a seat at one of the several different tables that were set up and enjoyed a fine Christmas dinner and were part of the caroling that took place afterwards. And then as they took their leave and hugged everybody, people started saying, well, now who are those lovely young men? And everybody was eventually quizzed, and nobody had a clue who they were. They were just two random strangers, two soldiers who had nowhere to go that day, and who, by just happening upon the right lawn at the right time, stumbled into something that would have probably felt more like home to them than they had experienced for a long time. The idea of taking in the stranger is so beautifully illustrated in that story, and that's always been a part of my Christmas experience. In the first 23 years of my life, I was not the stranger or the outsider, but being on the other side of that stick in my early life made it much more possible for me to make a pleasant adjustment to being the stranger or orphan, as I recall it later in life. As I said, this is a little bit of a self-indulgent sermon. I've sort of a personal need for public confession and reflection at this time of year, since I'm lucky enough to have a frequent ready-made audience because of what I do for a living. You stalwart souls are going to hear a little bit more of this public confession and reflection today. The holiday season, with all of its baggage, both good and bad, always causes me to reflect back on my past and to contemplate moving forward to the future. Every Christmas, I think back to where I have been in my life, both physically and emotionally and spiritually, at Christmas seasons past. Now, on New Year's, I tend to think more of what I would like to manifest in the future. So in preparation for doing a sermon like this, every time I've done one, I have gone through and tried to reconstruct my entire history of where I've been at Christmas. Now, do not get upset. I'm not going to subject you to the entire story, because you would have to be resurrected from a coma at the end. But I just want to give you a few illustrations of why my personal story of strange and unusual adventures in the holidays might reflect some things about your story that you might not realize, because I think every one of us that doesn't get to experience the traditional kind of Christmas situation often feels like we are the one that is the freak. My earliest Christmases were spent in a totally chaotic extended family situation over in Nettleton nearby in my aunt's boarding house. Sad to say that building doesn't exist there anymore. It was torn down about 20 years ago. In fact, since the house we stayed in Christmas was this boarding house, with the addition of my grandfather and my 4 maiden aunts and my cousin Ernestine, who was sort of related to us, but I never could quite figure out how. I don't know, those of you that grew up in Southern families know there are always these random kinfolk that float around that nobody can ever quite explain, and she was one such person. There were also boarders there for most of the dining room meals all the time anyway, but they were even more prominently there during the holiday season. I never thought it was at all odd or distressing, because the boarders almost always gave my little sister and me presents and paid a lot of attention to us, while most of the blood relatives were busy decorating, cooking, or wrapping presents. So the great thing about it was no real distinction was ever made between who was related by blood or marriage and who just happened to be living or staying at the hotel during these holiday celebrations. Everyone was welcome. And indeed, my two aunts who ran businesses other than the boarding house in the little town often invited countless other strays to come, at least for the Christmas dinner. There were usually at least 2 seatings for Christmas dinner, and the children were usually grouped at a smaller children's table set up in other rooms of the house. And sometimes on a warm Christmas day, which we sometimes had down here, even on the screened-in back porch. In the afternoon, my mother, who was a professional singer, would go to the creaky piano that was always out of tune in the living room and play carols for us all to sing. Well, this was my early life, and I loved it. I loved the extended family, but at some point, the 4 of us who lived on the Gulf Coast at the time decided we were mature enough to try to do Christmas on our own. This seemed pretty daring and did not entirely meet with my approval. To sweeten the deal, they had decided to buy a television. Now, this was the 50s and not everybody had a TV. So this television ensured that we would not be alone in a nuclear family at all at Christmas. At one point, I believe I counted 15 people sitting in our little tiny living room, because we had a little apartment, watching the television because we had one of the first ones in the neighborhood. So the news that we had acquired a TV had gotten around, and everybody showed up. Most people brought food offerings of some sort to pay their way into the television viewing room. So our first Christmas away from the hotel was lacking in neither food or people. Now, over the years, as people are prone to do, we did develop our own unique family traditions, some of which were pretty odd. The exclusivity of Christmas was never one of them. My sister and I were both kind of performers at heart. Even as a child, I was preparing for a career as a person who talked for a living. We would put on little shows and plays for my family. We had taken dancing lessons, and we would dance, including some pretty odd things. One year there was a popular song called The Stripper. It had a great little, bump and grind beat. So we didn't actually strip, but we did a little dance to that because my parents were unusual and had been known to go to a burlesque show in New Orleans now and then. So to this day, I feel like any Christmas that I don't do some sort of a slightly exotic dance is simply a wasted occasion. So eventually, of course, I went to school and then moved away from home. So my first Christmas as being the orphan rather than part of a family taking in orphans was when I was about 24. I was teaching school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I had a college friend living with me who was Jewish, so she really didn't care much about Christmas anyway. Her tradition had been Chinese food and movies on Christmas. But I convinced her rather, that we should do something. So I started kind of putting the word out to people that I taught with at school and clubs I went to, and I managed to score us an invitation for both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Christmas Eve was with a family of folk singers, so we had much singing and a lot of drinking, to tell you the truth. And then Christmas Day, we ended up with a family named the Reyes family, and this was with absolutely the biggest collection of displaced radicals, just the type of people that were described in this little story from Christmas. I mean, it must have been, there were everything from Ed Abbey-styled environmentalists to political radicals, and the after-meal activity was to go out and tear down billboards, which is something that Edward Abbey advocated, and I thought, oh great, I'm going to be arrested on Christmas Day, and I'm going to go to prison. But it was an adventure, so I went out with them. I didn't actually do any tearing down myself, but it was quite fun, launching me on my entire life story of radicalism. Another orphan Christmas I spent a couple of years later when I'd moved back to D.C. and was sharing an apartment with 2 infrequently employed young actors. one of those young men had grown up in a family of caterers, and he decided we would do a Dickens-like Christmas. So we had a Christmas tree with actual candles on it, which of course almost burned down the entire building. And we had a collection, again, of all kinds of people, mostly more artistic types, but a few of these same political radicals. And after the very exotic meal of goose and other strange stuffings that I had never experienced, people performed for us. By the time I was in my late 20s and early 30s, I had a family, a biracial family that I had become kind of an informal godparent to the two children. I spent a lot of Christmases with them, but I would often bring another stray or two along with me. And of course, just like I had as a kid, the kids in the family loved the fact that there were these weird people there because they were bored to death with just their original parents and their siblings. So I brought in all the exotic presences, and everyone was always happy to be there. Later, as I got older and I got into cooking a little bit, I started to do thematic Christmases because I had been researching holidays because I was always interested in holidays in different places, and I learned about customs in other countries. So one year I did a Mexican-themed Christmas Eve, and we broke piñatas. And one of my friends said, well, Gail, what's next? Christmas in Iran? And I said, oh, well, who knows? Then at some point I started, and this was really revealing, I started having these Christmas Day brunches, which my thought was a few orphans, a few of the people that had nowhere else to go, could come and have brunch with me. And then many of them would go off and perhaps go to have dinner with their families or whatever. Well, these things got completely out of control. For about 5 years, I did these things, and so all kinds of people started hearing about them and calling me and saying, we understand you're having this great Christmas Day brunch, can we come? And I would say, well, I thought you had family here. Oh yeah, but we don't want to have to see them. I hadn't realized how bad things were until this happened. Many, many people have family and can't stand them. This was my first understanding of how Christmas is traumatic for people in ways that I had never encountered. Well, anyway, my life has been long and interesting, so enough of the details of this. But finally, when I was in seminary, I had a friend, a fellow seminarian, who had a son, and she had managed to break her ankle right before the holidays. So I didn't have any place to go. She said, oh, well, you can come over and cook Christmas dinner for us. Well, I'm not the most domestic person anyway. And of course, she has this 10-year-old son who expects everything to be exactly the way it's always been. So it was quite an adventurous day. I just couldn't really ever seem to do anything to quite please him. Nothing I cooked was just the way it's supposed to taste. I didn't quite get the tree decorated to his liking. It was very traumatic. And yet, as these things often work out later, my friend Dorothy said, oh, that Christmas you came and did everything for us, that was Daniel's favorite Christmas ever. He talks about it all the time. Because our mind plays tricks on us, and we think of things that at one point maybe seem disappointing or traumatic. Later on, they become some of our coziest and most wonderful experiences. One year, I even ended up with a family that ate roast beef for Christmas dinner. I was shocked. I had never had anything that wasn't in the poultry family, either a turkey, chicken, capon, Cornish hens, or goose, or duck. But there I was, and people acted like this was the most normal thing in the world, to sit there and have a Christmas roast with baked potatoes. And indeed, it was, of course, a wonderful meal. And I was pretty much with a completely strange family. When I was 45, I finally ended up having the Iranian Christmas that my disapproving friend had once predicted. It was the first of many Christmases that I spent with my friend and longtime roommate, who's still a person of interest in my life. I never know what to call him. He's been around for 30 years. This was in Boston after I had finished seminary. And my other guests were two friends, one of whom was from Iran, named Bajan Manavar, and they brought over all kinds of exotic Iranian dishes. And they were both also students with me at Harvard Divinity School. So we had this strange combination of Hindu, Muslim, my John had been raised a Catholic, all combining our religious practices and our customs, and we spent part of the day listening to a recording by Ram Dass, the famous Harvard guru, reading the Gospel of John from his album called Love, Serve, Remember. Just a total holiday mishmash. One year in my mid-40s, I decided to try to go home for Christmas again. And this was an unmitigated disaster, which cured me of that urge forever. I got to D.C. I flew down from Boston to D.C. in the middle of a blizzard. And they announced to us that nobody was going to be flying out to North Carolina that night. They checked us. In those days, they gave vouchers, so they gave us all a voucher for a nearby hotel. We were to go spend the night there, come back the next day. Guess what? Blizzard's still going on the next day. I said, okay, I've had enough. I called my sister and I said, I'm just going to go check into a hotel in D.C. and see what can happen. So here I am showing up at the Hilton Hotel on Christmas Eve. I thought, oh, this is going to be so depressing. I'm such a pitiful little creature. Here I am all alone without my family, nobody around. I went down, there was a wonderful restaurant and bar in the Hilton at that time, Trader Vic's. It's kind of an exotic Polynesian place. And guess what? There were tons of other stranded travelers there. So it was a perfect Christmas. It was sort of a refugee Christmas. We had drinks with little umbrellas in them. We ate huge poo-poo platters, they're called, of exotic Asian foods, and we had a great time. There was a piano in the restaurant, and we had played music. One year, I was doing a wedding over Christmas by the time I had moved to Flagstaff, Arizona, and was doing some ministry work. I was invited to a pre-wedding Bengali dinner cooked by a Bengali stepdaughter of the couple that I was doing their wedding for. They had both been, of course, married before. So there I was, eating, again, exotic food with people in costumes of their native country, and it was fantastic. When I became a full-time minister in Florida, I got invited to what I called orphan ministers gatherings. Because most ministers, because we do Christmas Eve and sometimes Christmas Day services, didn't have anywhere to really go on Christmas Day, we gathered together and celebrated. Sometimes it was mostly Unitarian ministers, but oftentimes there were people from other denominations, and we would tell minister horror stories, etc. I've also done the traditional Chinese food and movie activity with Jewish friends over the years. And I spent other later Christmases with my friend and godchildren in Florida when my friend got a condo down there after I was doing ministry there. Every one of these Christmases has had something unique about it. Every one of them has been ennobling and enlightening. I only spent one holiday alone in all those years of not being around family. And that was primarily for lack of my putting out the feelers that I had nowhere to go. I spent a couple of Christmas dinners with parishioners and their families when I was ministering in Fort Lauderdale for those 18 years. And then in my 60s, some of you know, I adopted my son David. And then all of a sudden I had a family again. And David, having been homeless himself some, was very active in ministering to the homeless community. So then our tradition became we would go and serve food in the park in Fort Lauderdale called Stranahan Park to the homeless. We wouldn't eat. We would just bring food along with people from other churches. And then David and I would go eat Indian food and go to the movies. So having him back in my life has sort of brought me full circle. And then I moved back to Mississippi to actual family. So now, once again, for the last 3, and this will be the 4th Christmas, I'm gathered with blood relatives, some more and some less, depending on what year and who comes home. And I've gotten back into a more traditional Christmas of wrapping gifts and going to exchanging gifts with the bosom of family. And now that I have my own little nuclear family again, Christmas has kind of come full circle for me. What I've learned from all these adventures over the years is that we create home and family and community whenever we make commitments, give love, and seek to offer ourselves. Strangers can become family, and then we can be home for Christmas wherever we go. And I want to close with a little piece that I think it's instructive for all of us to keep in mind during this holiday season, whatever our current plans are. And that is, we never know what situation people are in this season that we think of as supposed to be so festive. Here's to the walking wounded, to those still carrying a little heartbroken boy or girl inside, to those who feel rejected and lonely, to those who woke up with a dull ache inside, to those who are wondering where God is in the midst of their deep pain, to those whose past wounds have been pulled open yet again, to those weary and worn out and longing for some place called home, to those in the darkness who can't find the light, to those who wonder if they will ever find love, to those who feel misunderstood, to the abandoned and discarded, to those who feel they're running out of reasons to get out of bed each morning, to those in the clutches of depression, to those who are smiling on the outside but dying on the inside, to those suffering in silence. Here's to the walking wounded. You too would be welcome in someone's home for a healing experience and a Merry Christmas.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.